Good afternoon and welcome to the first Waterfront Forum. My name is Daniel Johnston. I'm the CEO for the Edmonds Waterfront Center, home of the Edmonds Senior Center. And I'm happy to report that tomorrow we're scheduled to get our certificate of occupancy for the new building. And so what we'd love to do is to invite everyone on this call into the building, but we're not able to do that right now. So we're closely monitoring the public health department and the state guidelines, which will determine when we can invite you in. But our vision has always been to create a place to gather, learn, and celebrate. So I think today we are going to prove that we can do that virtually while we wait for the building for us to be able to invite you in. We are delighted to be rolling out Edmonds from the beginning. This is a 3-part Zoom series with presentations from local experts. Today's topic is the significance of place. This is being presented by speaker, author, and executive educator, Carol Sanford. I had an opportunity to chat with Carol earlier in the week, and she is a delight. And, you know, there's only a few of us who could rock a red hat like she can. But Carol is a true Edmonds treasure. She is a senior fellow of social innovation at Babson College. She's CEO for the Regenerative Paradigm Institute. She's an educator and social change designer for people in change agent roles, organizational leaders who aspire to making a difference, business and organizational teams pursuing meaningful work and business effectiveness. Who doesn't want all that? I know I'm interested. Carol is also author of 5 best-selling books. The Regenerative Life, Transform Any Organization, Our Society, Your Destiny, No More Feedback, and The Regenerative Business. So the way that this will work today is Carol's going to speak for 25 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So you can just send me questions via chat, and we will answer as many as we can in, say, 10 minutes or so. So we'll get everyone back to their day after we finish the Q&A. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Carol Sanford.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you, Michelle, for all your technical support and care making this happen. This is a subject very dear to my heart, as is Edmonds. And all of us know when we live here, there's something special. We come here because we want to, not because we had a company who forced us to transfer here. No, there is something that we call it like the Edmonds way, but I believe that's too vague. I don't believe it allows you to understand at a deep enough level and to use it in a way I want to talk about today, because story of place and understanding place can bring people together, can create economic viability that improves community viability, that improves ecosystem health. And so I want to share with you how that works. I need to put my PowerPoint up here. Somebody is disabled. I can't share screen. Yeah, Michelle, I can't share. You've disabled screen sharing. Okay, now we've got it. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so I call this really thinking about story of place. And you were already getting a taste of why I think it's important, because it is a difference in a community to have a shared story. And I don't mean they all agree with each other. I mean, they understand what this place's story is and how it can bring community vitality and viability. I want to start right now with thanking Keely O'Connor and Terry Olmstead, who were kind enough to have me interview them a bit, but I take responsibility for any errors I make in what they gave me. And I will not be able to answer questions about some of the content. We'll forward you over to them if there is some. But let's talk about really what it means to be thinking about place. And I want to start with the idea that I don't use terms like place-based or place-making, because those are very anthropocentric terms about humans imposing their will, no matter how benevolent, no matter how sustainably, onto a place. Place source means we connect with the story of a place. And I'm going to show you briefly how people who want to do that get help. It's not something the average individual can do, but it's very doable. When we're place source, we really honor everything from our past and we use it as a way to image our future. And it grows if you think about it from this interrelationship between Earth and local nature, where we've been, the soil, the water, where we've been, the cultures, Native peoples' cultures, colonist cultures, all the cultures that have happened over time to brought us to the collective of who we are as a living whole, and the distinctiveness of this place. Now, you can't say just Edmonds, because that's a geographic boundary, but it's a part of a Puget Sound watershed with sub-watersheds. And so much of what I'm going to say would go beyond that, but still is very relevant to Edmonds. So why would we want to source from the idea of place? Well, each place has its own being. It's a living entity. It has an origin story. Long before humans were here, as humans came here, as new humans and displaced old humans, and as various species, if we know all of that, where it came from, it can make a huge difference. And then a community or a village, as it learns to reveal this with professional help, can align itself and see, my goodness, we as people even operate that way. And so we all come to love a shared place-sourced home. Couple of quick examples, work that my colleagues did, and I don't go develop the story of place. I use them often in what I'm doing, but Portland is one place where after all the work I'm going to show you, they ended up talking about, wow, Portland is an outdoors place. It's where people live, not just exercise all year round. One of the few places on the planet that people by choice do that. It's led to the kind of so many different athletic companies and athletic gear and bicycling and an accelerated rate, which as Portland embraced that, they began to design indoors and outdoors. We did a similar set of work with Loreto, Mexico, understanding that's where the whales that inhabit our sphere go to birth. And it became a birthing place and began to rethink how that community could be built. I'm going to drop quickly to McAllen, Texas, which out of the work of Story of Place realized that they had from their founding been about fair trade between Europeans who had come here. McAllen is a Scottish guy, and the local people. And they have now been building themselves. And of course, think about the joy of thinking about being fair in your trade rather than extractive in your trade. That's the kind of work people are able to do once they understand their history and the story. Now, how do you get to that? You have to discover it. This is not a community meeting where you pull people together, everybody says what they want, you ratchet it down till you all agree. Nope, you don't start with the people and what they want. You start with revealing the history. And it's called an integral assessment. And you have professionals who are involved in doing this. And there are social and cultural anthropologists, earth scientists. That's why I talked to Keeley and to Terry. I needed their perspective. Cognitive and behavioral psychologists, there's how the humans work here. I didn't get an opportunity to do that, although I'm going to give you a candidate idea, not to get attached to, but to show you what I got from them that might give us a hint of the story of this place we could use. You talk with government officials and the settlers and the pre-settlers, the tribal stories that are there, and the economics and urban studies. You go look at historical documents, at the history of the place, its conflict, its growth, and that's everything from humans to natural systems. What do earthquakes, move of glacial processes look like? You talk to the wisdom keepers, the first people, their stories, they are great storytellers. And if you can sit quietly enough, you can come to understand the history of a place just with the stories people are telling and in an oral tradition. There are folks who seek to steward the history of a place, like our local Edmonds Museum and societies, which I'm a part of. And the artisans who are here who draw and create based on that understanding. And you go read fictional and non-fictional works of local authors writing about place and with people even from outside who know about it. Now, why in the world would you want to do all of that? Well, it turns out there are some real advantages that speak to the significance of place. There is a report done annually, and the one a couple of years ago had 127 cities who've done this kind of place sourcing. And they all reported being on the top of the scale they were given, of feeling new life, new aliveness, people who love to be there, social, ecological, economically, all felt alive much more when a place knew what it was versus the kind of conflicts and fighting over land use that tend to happen. I think we could use some of that. It is memory honoring. It celebrates the roots and culture of a place. It gets everyone to know about that, because the people who come late or the people who were born recently may not know the history of the place. And it helps everyone connect to its deep, deep identity and its origin story from a non-human perspective, from more of a living system. It helps them to understand what makes it, Edmonds, what it is today, and what is the potential in terms of what it can bring and we can support. It makes communities resilient. We have a whole lot of up and down markets through the history of time. These cities who do this story of place process and get connected to who they are have a lot less volatility and a lot quicker recovery. So they have less layoffs, less closings of businesses, because they are building on who they really are, and that stays a constant. It helps us really find the nodal points, like where you can put an acupuncture pin that would really be the most effective way you could work. So if you're sitting on a city council or an economic development council or the arts council or the chamber of commerce or the business community, you're asking very different kinds of questions, not what could we do and make a list and hope you can get agreement. But you start with the creative source of what is the story of this place. So you can see it's going to be important when I get just a little further along here, how we come to know what that might be for this region. It also repeatedly resolves conflicts that have stayed unresolved for years. And I don't have time to give you all the stories today, but I'm going to give you a website you can go to and read places that have been in conflict for decades and some generations beyond that, that were over land use, over the way schools should run, the fiscal policy, how transportation, urban decisions. And once they had created this storying of a place, and it is a verb, storying, it has to be alive. These communities also become much more resourceful. They become very wise with resources. When people know about their place and it becomes the ground, the foundation of the conversations at every city council meeting, at every government administration, every education community, every senior center, suddenly you don't feel like you want to squander those resources or damage them in any way. So you simultaneously get a vital and viable economic community and a wise use, a much more resourceful use of what is there. In fact, you pretty much quit calling them resources because it's more like what we're trading and engaging with, and you'll see why that is a part of our story. So here is my candidate, and I'm not wedded to it. I don't think we're done. But Keely and I had so much fun talking about this, and you can't blame her for this because I took what she said and I'm used to finding the essence. And here were the 3 windows I saw. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I think I understood that she and Terry were telling me. One of the things about this region, this massive watershed, is that the kind of provisioning, the kind of food sources and opportunity to move and the kind of resources that are here is unbelievably prolific. What it meant was the people who have lived here forever and the new ones as they come in, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Not sure what that was. But what we find is if you go back through history, all of the different tribes, and there were many, and I'm not going to try and state who all those are today, but it is a rich source of coming to learn about it. And Keely can help give us some references. We can put them in the PowerPoint when you go out. And wow, I'm allergic to all of you. I must be. That you can learn if you want to know more about the nature of fishing and animal life and farming life, but also natural harvesting and gathering processes that have gone on forever in the entire arena that surrounds the Puget Sound. Now, it meant that people who came here or who were born here, or the people who came, were startled to see how the people who, the First Nations or first people who had been here, were not struggling at all. They had a camaraderie, they had an understanding. They stood inside of the experience of the region, and they understood how to work with it, what it provided, what depended on what else. Why? What we were looking at wasn't a watershed. That's a very modern term. A watershed means that's where my water comes from. And then there's other groups who call it the food shed. That's where my food is, or air shed. Instead, Native peoples, First Nations, called them life sheds. The translation is much better because that's where all of life is. And it is the life that goes deep into the sea and that which goes high into the mountains. The next thing, which is so unique. I mean, Keely said when I asked her, do you know of any other place on the planet that has this set of contrasts? She said, not really. And they're commanding in the sense that they really get your attention. So there were 3 different kinds that we looked at. One was the contrast between wide and narrow. So you have straits, which are very narrow, but then you have open bodies of water, which are very far apart and hold enormous contrast. And if you get on a map, and she gave me several, but it was going to take too long to talk about them, you can see this contrast between wide and narrow, wide and narrow. That's going to tell us something about us also as a people in a moment. There was also deep and high. So the glaciers digging down into the troughs that have created the sound made huge, deep gouges that we have deeper water and gives us different kind of flora and fauna than most places have. But we also have these very high mountains. I mean, I sit here and look out my window at the Olympic mountain range, and it's just a profoundly beautiful experience. And I can envision that below that, there would be a slide which would go very, very deep. There's also fresh water and salt water that come together in very few places who can have this exchange going on while they have these huge contrasts and the wide and narrow. So these commanding contrasts provide us a way to look at what is it that is possible for us. So if I were doing economic development here, which I'm not going to do, I don't do that anymore, but if I were, I would say, well, what is it that really benefits from strong contrast? So for example, we would have restaurants that have really strong contrasts, like East and West, like fusion food, like Schubert Ho does. I mean, salt and iron. Even the marketplace has a fusion kind of food. And Schubert himself has this beautiful combination of an Asian lineage, but a modern chef and ability to create this. And of course, he's going to be a part of what the Waterfront is doing. He and those restaurants are examples of what it means to draw from, to source from these enormous contrasts and make them so clear. We think, well, why haven't we done that before? Why haven't we been able to have tacos that were Asian? Never thought about that before. We also would be thinking about businesses and art centers that combine strong contrasts like art and science. We might have companies we invited in and did accelerators and startup work that help people think about how do you bring art and science together. I mean, it's like what Apple did with a great technology, but beautiful cases, and has continued to hold under their market. Now, we have the seeds of that here that can work in a way that is profoundly able to build off of these contrasts. We can do the same thing in building. When we have new buildings come up, if our group was listening to these kind of ideas, what they might do when they're listening to land use planning or building is they would say, how do we maintain these strong contrasts, this wide and narrow? And how do we put into it things that are so strongly contrasted, but they make a lot of sense when they come together? And they create uniqueness that we can feel because it is also a part of our landscape. It is telling the story and creating from the story. The third area that I have here is this place has also been one that has always been involved in co-creative reciprocity. Now, what I mean by that is, as far as we know, and as far as I could do my own follow-up research, and Kaylee knew, the tribal people here, as far back as we know, have worked in a peaceful way in trade and travel. Part of that is clearly our landscape. You can go amazing number of directions easily, very far in stream. You can work to go find tribes who have things that, you know, as you might all know, there are people who fish. There are people who hunt bears. There are people who do logging. And in many places, people end up at war over that, and they try and dominate and control it all. What it appears is our history has a strong story of people doing what makes sense to them based on where they live, based where they are in the life shed. And it never occurs to them they have to go own the piece where people are fishing in a particular place or go do the whaling for oil. What you had was this, and still have, for the most part, this co-creative reciprocity. That is our history. That's how we got to who we are. So the nature of the Puget Sound and Edmonds, when you look at the coming together of humans and nature and their history based on this work that you do with anthropology, with science, biology, talking with hydrologists, with economic history, with settlement patterns, with our culture and our philosophy. If you know all of that and you begin to tell that story, it's amazing. When I worked in Paonia, Colorado, they had been at war with guns ever since the Wild West. And yet they had so much creativity that were going on within what they called, their self-called, the hippie community, who are doing sun and solar, and the miners and the ranchers. And we found that the essence of that place was, its story of its place was that it teaches others. Like the mining community had taught people how to do safe mining, and the head of the mining became the head of the police force in Denver because they knew how to teach people to do it a safe way. The solar people had been teaching globally people how to do solar. So we looked at, I think the story of this place is a learning community. I think the story of Edmonds is to build off of these commanding contrasts that are there. And the other thing we could do is, what if we were the people who could help us quit having war between Republican and Democrat, and we're able to find something that contrast each are bringing. And we built a whole community where people came here to learn how to have the difficult conversations that could bring us into a single story, not to make trade-offs, but to go deep into something. That potential, I'm not saying I'm going to do it or you could, but just to show you what a story of place does. So if you're going to found a restaurant or a store, think about this history just a bit, and it will give you some background in thinking. One last thing. It is not a citizen-led process to go do this, because our egos get in the way. In all the cities around the world where I've done this, including in South Africa and brought Regenesis in, it's never been a citizen visioning process, because the ego says, I want this, you want that, let's put some dots on the board, let's average it all down. It's not average it up. So you don't do citizen visioning because you start with fragments. You don't start with the story. It is not a public policy process where government leads it and figures it out. It has always been led by a special group who wants to make it happen, often funded by businesses who really want to figure out how to have a community that works, and have a community planning process that works, and to have a political process that works. But it's not from politics. It's not from community planning or economic planning. It's not policy. It's not citizens. It might be something like the museum, or maybe the waterfront center, right? Where you bring together the resource it takes to pull this into existence. So let me end up with saying that I have seen this surpass all possible conflicts that existed. I've seen people bring together creativity, like in Austin, Texas. As the 2008 economy was diving, they were soaring because they were building off of a story of that place. Paris has used this, where you're looking at the city of lights. What does that mean? What does light mean? Where did that come from? And any city who begins to see itself, or a community, and ours might be more than Edmonds, has a chance of providing global leadership and certainly making the place they live feel unity and shared. So thank you very much. And Daniel, I turn it back to you.
Carol, thank you so much for your comments. I want to learn much more about what you're describing here, and to look at how we might apply that into telling our story about our space, because we know how sacred our space is down on the water.
You have to learn to find the story too. Don't start with telling, start with revealing. But great, glad you're interested.
So this would be a time for anyone to submit questions. I have a couple of questions here, and please feel free to use your chat or the Q&A option. So one question, Carol, is, so what capabilities do we need to work this way? It's a different way of looking at the world. It's a different way of working. What are the capabilities we need to do this?
It's literally a different mind. I referenced it a while ago as the indigenous mind. Generally, it's a mind that stops being the activist of we go make things happen, we impose our will, and we get what we want. To a revealing mind, understanding what is there, not what we want to impose on it. And that's not just very easy to do. As I start with people, they have a very hard time switching. They say, well, we can make it what we want. And I said, yeah, we could, and we would make a mess. So the real first one is learning that we have different minds we can use. And you might call it perspectives or worldviews. If you go stand, and I know we're going to have a second speaker on indigenous stories. I'm not sure what all is involved in that. Notice how the mind they're talking about is different than the constructive mind. So that's what I believe is the first and foundational capability.
Great, thank you. We have another question here. And the participant said, I am curious to learn more about the concept of combining art and science here in Edmonds to blend contrasts.
Well, that's something I made up as an example of what we might do. I don't know. What you want to start with is the story. And what matters is commanding contrast. And I said, that is to me a commanding one. I watched it. It might be an example, but you would need a group of people who were thinking about, first, am I right about commanding contrast? And it's Keely and Terry's stories they've told me, am I interpreting correctly? And then you do a charrette where you get a lot of people to begin to see that. So there's a lot of work. I don't know how to do that. When I worked in McLean, we did fair trade, capital of the world. It took a whole lot of work to figure out what fair trade meant when you sit on the border between Mexico and Texas. So I want to know more about it too, but first I want to find out if it's the right direction.
Great. So someone else wrote, what do you feel is the most important takeaway for today?
I guess what I'm trying to say in a bunch of ways is move away from place located. This is my place, I get to do what I want, or place base where we're trying to get everybody to buy local, move beyond place making where we're trying to impose things and get into place sourced. Sourcing from what is here, has been here throughout history and natural systems, and then settlement patterns. Be willing to submit our own ego, our own anthropocentric, and in fact, if I may say, our own arrogance, including mine. I have to work on this all the time. I was raised with a Western worldview that doesn't start with natural living systems and how they work. And so I think that's the thing I hope people say. If you hear somebody say place base or place making, you say, no, I've been thinking about place sourced and what that would mean to reveal the story of a place and join in a co-creative reciprocity with all that. That's what I'd like for people to do. Language matters. It programs our mind.
Great. So we have a couple more. One individual said, I wonder if we could begin acknowledging the story of this place by starting every one of these and future meetings with acknowledging that this is unceded Salish territory of the Duwamish and Suquamish people. And we actually try to do that with our public events, and it's a good reminder that we should do that with these as well. So I appreciate that comment.
Can I comment on it too?
Yes, please.
All right. So I love that idea. I am part Mohawk. I was raised by a half grandmother, grandfather who were Mohawk Iroquois. And my grandfather used to have a wonderful saying, as he said, the Westerners, my dear child, as you grow up, will have great things to demonstrate to you their empathy. And they will be of no meaning past the moment. They will give you money. They will bring you goods. They will acknowledge that they were wrong, or they will create some ceremony, and then they go about the way they live on a regular basis. So I worry that that becomes the token of what we do, rather than learn to think. What we all have to do is learn to think with the Iroquois mind. And I'm reading a new book, a Sand Talk, and it's written out of an author out of Australia, which talks about how we have to go get the whole story, because the indigenous people story is a part of it, but it's not all of it. It doesn't always include the land itself, the natural system itself. It doesn't include the settlement patterns and the culture. What it does is said some people lived here before me. So I really love acknowledging that idea, but I don't want it to be a substitute for really coming to think with a more complete mind of which that's nested in.
Great. Well, this next question, I think, sort of gets at some of the points you're making there. And this individual wrote, the resources we once had are much diminished. Do we lose our sense of place when we lose the giant cedars, salmon, and marsh?
Story is not something that's held in existence. I mean, my grandfather told me stories about what it had been like when his grandparents were alive, and they were so alive in him. We don't have very good oral cultures. And I think part of what I'm advocating here for is we do the work, not as an involvement, participative citizen process, but as a deep historical search engagement process. And that as a result of that, it becomes embedded in us as a narrative. and we pass that along, it's the same way as talking about our ancestors. Obviously, it's insane that we managed to take down the giant cedars and we can't touch them, but we can't stop everything else or slow it down or even look at what the potential is of reseeding a place, which we did in McAllen, Texas. Go to regenesisgroup.com's website and you'll see the story of Laredo and how based on the story, they went, oh my goodness, we don't have things here that clearly were here before. Can we seed those? Can it become a part of an economic structure? Can it become a community idea and design process for urban planning? And yes, it can. And so I don't want to advocate or act like I don't care that my husband was a forester. But what we have to do is bring the stories back to life, or else they aren't in us. We can't operate from them.
Great. Carol, thank you. We've run out of time. I want to thank you so much for your comments and your thoughtful responses to the questions. I do want to make one quick commercial if I can, because this was the first in a series of 3 sessions. The next one is on January 27th, Indigenous Peoples, presented by Dennis Luarch. And he's from the Suwamish tribe, and he's a tribal archaeologist. And then on February 10th, we have Early Settlers, Sawmill Town, presented by Katie Kelly, Director of Edmonds Historical Society. So we'll be sending out notices and we hope you will all join us. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.